Kamal, you're at the headquarters of the very slick cooperative group in Manchester. What are your main thoughts?
I am Camilla. I'm joined by our wonderful political editor, Ben Riley-Smith. We were on the early train this morning. Was it President Starmer? 33 pictures of Sir Keir Starmer in the manifesto, not many of anyone else. Ben, what's your take on the big day for the possible next Labour government?
I think big picture, this was a safety-first manifesto. Keir Starmer didn't want to scare the horses. It was all about telling the country you could trust him with your money, with the nation's defences and with the keys to number 10.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla Tominey in London.
And me, Kamal Ahmed in Manchester.
Kamal, this was Sir Keir Starmer's big moment. Were you getting recollections of 1997? Same vibe or not?
I did cover 1997. I also covered 1992 when Neil Kinnock didn't win against John Major. 1992 was my first election campaign as a young whippersnapper reporter. There was certainly energy here. It didn't feel, Camilla, from what you said, and Ben, what you said from Silverstone and the Conservative manifesto launch, which felt flat. You really felt the energy sort of disappearing from the Conservatives because they're so far behind in the polls. Here, we're at the Co-op headquarters. Quite an interesting signal there about Labour's communitarian past, not its socialist past. Co-op, a very central part of Labour's overall history. Many MPs are actually Labour and Cooperative Party MPs, sometimes forgotten. So quite a signal there. We're in Manchester, not in sort of North London, a long way from where Keir Starmer's from. They deliberately set it up so there was standing room only. There are lots of big balconies here. It's an open atrium we're just sitting towards the bottom of. And there were people leaning over the balconies watching who, work for the co-op business. And we were all crowded in and there weren't enough seats. So they sort of got this idea that this is dramatic. They have to be quite careful, though, Camilla, because anyone can remember back to 1992, the famous Sheffield rally where Neil Kinnock, then the Labour leader, came on and started chanting, "We're all right, we're all right." And they introduced the next UK Labour cabinet, and all these shadow cabinet members walked on before any vote had been cast. This time, a lot more humility from Labour. I think they've got to be careful. Overdo it, 1992, and they're going to look like they're taking the votes for granted. Underdo it and they look like Rishi Sunak. I think they got that tone just about right. Just three quick things, though, I think are the problems for them. And they can't answer these questions. And Ben, you actually literally asked one of these questions. Jeremy Corbyn, you backed him, Sir Keir Starmer, in 2019. And now you're saying you no longer back him and actually you've chucked him out of the party. Why should we trust you? Second thing, what is the immigration cap figure? You say you're going to bring immigration down. To what number? He didn't answer. Third issue, tax. How are you going to guarantee, given that you've made no commitment on thresholds, that working people will not be paying more tax?
Ben, before we drill into this point about whether he's been Captain Cautious rather than doing anything a little bit more tub-thumping, let's just hear him react to Beth Rigby of Sky News when she puts that to him.
Thank you, Chris. Beth.
Thank you. Beth Rigby, Sky News. Keir Starmer, this is a 132-page document. On the cover it says change, but there's not a single new policy in it you haven't already announced. There's no new retail offer for voters. Rishi Sunak threw the kitchen sink at his manifesto. You won't even take the safety catch off yours. Is this a Captain Caution manifesto designed to protect your poll lead? Thank you.
No. It is a serious plan for the future of our country. And every single policy in this document, policy after policy after policy, has been carefully thought through and tested to ensure that we can deliver it. I am not going to do what Rishi Sunak did, which is to offer things that he can't deliver because they're unfunded. People have had too much of that. They're fed up with that. This is a serious plan, carefully thought through. It's not about rabbits out the hat. It's not about pantomime. We've had that. I'm running as a candidate to be Prime Minister, not a candidate to run the circus.
I mean, Ben, we've talked about the bland leading the bland before. This was reminiscent of the Tories in Silverstone. This was a manifesto containing stuff we already know they're going to propose. Votes for 16-year-olds, scrapping of the hereditary lords. Well, we've been given hints of that. They're suggesting that lords should retire at 80. Building 1.5 million new homes. Again, we've heard all that. We've heard that they want to reduce net migration. And we've heard this idea of not increasing VAT, income or national insurance. But you've delved into the costings, Ben, and you seem to have identified £8.6 billion worth of tax rises.
Well, that for me is one of the most interesting bits of the manifesto, because they had to put numbers on all of their tax rising and spending proposals to come up with some figures. When you hear Keir Starmer speak, if anybody's watched the debates or watched the speech today, he is implying he wants tax to come down, because he keeps on saying, I want tax to be reduced on working people. But when you actually look at the proposals of the manifesto, they are explicitly proposing an 8 billion increase in taxes by the end of their 5-year term. So I did put that to him to see if he was going to contest it, and fundamentally they're not.
Ben, this issue of tax, I think, is going to come up again and again over the next, what we are only just 3 weeks away from actual election day. I got a little hint, Camilla, of a slight change of tone. I caught up with Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, the person who is likely to be the first female chancellor for in the UK. And this question about how can you say, without raising thresholds, so that's the point at which people start paying income tax, without raising thresholds in line with inflation, how can you say that if those thresholds are frozen for 3 years, people will not pay more tax? Because they will, just a function of people's income going up. More people will be dragged into either paying income tax at the lowest level or into higher brackets of income tax. I put that point to her again. And I don't know, Camilla, just have a listen to this, but I got a sense that they are going to look at this thresholds issue if they win on July the 4th.
I want taxes on working people to be lower. We currently have the highest tax burden in 70 years. We've made that commitment not to increase income tax, national insurance or VAT. But unlike the Conservatives, I am not going to make any commitments either on tax or spending without being able to say where the money is going to come from. So of course I would like to lower those taxes, but we need to deliver the economic growth that we set out in this manifesto to be able to do that.
And will the thresholds remain frozen for 3 years as the government has already announced?
Well, I would like for taxes on working people to come down, but I'm not going to play fast and loose with the public finances. When a government does that, you get a repeat of what Liz Truss does, and frankly, it's what Rishi Sunak offered in the Conservative manifesto this week, a whole bunch of unfunded, uncosted policies that if the Conservatives have a chance to enact will crash our economy in the same way that Liz Truss did.
What's interesting here is when we talk about Sunak throwing red meat to the right, he's obviously trying to accommodate the people who are flirting with the idea of voting for Nigel Farage's reform. I don't know what the equivalent is of what Keir Starmer could throw to the left. Tofu? I'm not sure. But the point is, this was unashamedly, as he had said, not a Jeremy Corbyn manifesto, right? And then, of course, the dissatisfaction about that among the harder left is expressed by this heckler, who I don't know if she was in. I mean, it was quite convenient, actually, to have this heckler basically saying that Keir Starmer was a Tory in red clothing, escorted from the hall. What was that moment like?
I think you're right, Camilla. It was almost as if the Labour Party couldn't have asked for anything better, because she stood up very reminiscent of many of the types of people who did support Jeremy Corbyn really powerfully in 2017 and 2019. This idea that the Labour Party needed to be harder left, just like Reform UK want the Conservatives to be harder right. It doesn't work for the main majority of voters. They want their parties usually to be somewhere in the middle. And Keir Starmer's comeback to that young person when she unravelled her banner and she said, "You're just Tories in disguise," was, we used to be a party of protest 5 years ago. We've changed. And my goodness, that did land the point. I just want to pick at one point. I want to ask Ben about this. I think we as journalists are sometimes too eager to look at the rabbit out of the hat. Oh, there's nothing new here. Oh, goodness me, there's nothing new here. Well, as Keir Starmer said in an interview, I think it was with The Times a couple of weeks ago, I'm not going to start juggling the Ming vase now. the public only hear a very few messages from a party. They don't listen like we listen. So frankly, he's just got to get this over the line. So he would say, I'm just showing the kind of person I am, rather than here are some new flashy policies.
Yeah, I'd say two things. When you talk to Labour folk, they say there are actually some pretty ambitious goals and plans in this manifesto. The one they often talk about is clean energy by 2030. That's 5 years earlier than the Tory government is currently planning to do it. And Keir Starmer often says, look, if you talk to experts about them, they will tell you that is really, really hard and possibly impossible, but we want to go for it. So just because it's not new doesn't mean it's not ambitious. That's what they would argue. But yes, the politics is pretty clear. 3 weeks tomorrow, Keir Starmer, in all likelihood, is going to be Prime Minister unless there's a crazy change in the polls. So I think they would be perfectly happy if by the weekend people weren't talking about the manifesto, because that hadn't changed any of the dynamics of the race and they remained miles ahead and they won. But I think actually looking through the document, there are a lot of question marks. I think a colleague in the parliamentary lobby said there are 18 reviews. So reviews basically means come back to us once we're in government and we're going to work out what we're going to do. Tuition fees was one area where for months and months and months they've been promising to do something, indicating that some kind of sizable package was coming. There is no detail of any new policy announcement on tuition fees. So fundamentally, we're going to have to find out some of what their policy positions are after the election if they get into government.
Chaps, can you just clarify what's going on in the background? Because it sounds as if Keir Starmer is performing some of those emergency dental appointments right now.
No, Camilla, as usual, just like with Silverstone, they are dismantling all the paraphernalia, the stage, make a change, deliver better Britain. All those things are being unwound by lots of engineers and chippies. So sorry for any background noise.
They're actually so desperate to get going with the 6 steps. They're literally rolling up the banners, which have each of them, and running away with them.
Well, you see, thank goodness there isn't an Ed Stone. Oh, speaking of which, you did bump into the lesser spotted Ed Miliband. Kamal,
I did, and that
what
just
did he have
up.
To say?
I did, Camilla. You can look on our socials for my discussion with him. He did say he was out and about a lot, talking about this green energy pledge. I think just from what you've said, Ben, they do need to have a mandate, and people should look at the document. As for us journalists, a lot of it isn't new, but they should look at the document. Ed did make this big point about the green energy plan is an essential part of Labour's prospectus for the next 5 years. He did talk about GB energy. But frankly, as we spoke about yesterday, Camilla, that is not going to fire up voters because they don't understand what that is. They have certainly made climate de minimis in this election campaign because they know that the two big areas are the economy and the NHS. They had a very moving part before Keir Starmer came on stage. A man called Nathaniel talking about his cancer and that he hadn't got treated in the right amount of time. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, I think, Ben, I don't know if you saw her, I think she was in tears at part of that. She certainly was dabbing her eyes and she looked very emotional. And on our socials, I did ask her about that and she does talk about it. I think, Camilla, these types of events, of course, it is absolutely right to hold Keir Starmer to account, to make sure around the points you make about flip-flopping, etc., and can we trust him? But you were really hearing here a core Labour audience. These are people who believe in, bringing their bridges. They're not dividers. They believe in kind of bringing people together. You felt a real tone of the kind of Labour family, if you could call it that, coming together in a way that I haven't seen since 1997. You touched on 1997. Corbyn was a divisive figure for Labour. Don't forget, Rachel Reeves left the shadow cabinet under Corbyn and went and served as the chair of the Business Select Committee. She wouldn't serve under him, nor would Yvette Cooper. They were both here in the front row of this manifesto launch. So the notion of the Labour family coming together, I think this is sometimes what those who sort of attack Labour don't quite understand, maybe because they maybe haven't followed them as closely. And I mean their political opponents, is that if the Labour family can coalesce around this idea of slightly communitarian and we can do better, it is quite motivating for their core support.
When I interviewed Keir Starmer a couple of times for a big piece we did for the Telegraph, he talked quite openly about how concerned he is pretty much about the impact on his family and his 2 children who are teenagers from moving from Kentish Town into Downing Street. His wife doesn't do any interviews, unlike some political wives. Rishi Sunak's wife has done interview. They actually asked the media not to name their 2 children. If names ever get out there, they ask you to retract them. It's a very understandable instinct to try and protect his family. Remember, this guy wasn't in politics until he was 52. His entire life has been not having that type of scrutiny. So, yeah, it's an open question about how much of a role she will play if Keir Starmer does become Prime Minister.
One thing, Camilla, that came up here, which I thought was interesting, and you could feel their kind of eyes flickering about how best to respond to this, is this attack line from the Conservatives around the supermajority. They've clearly got a very good line about why we're not announcing a confetti of new policies, because that's what the Conservatives have done. So we can say we're not like them, so therefore steady as she goes. So stop the chaos, more caution, be sensible. Where they've not yet worked out their political position is how do they deal with this issue of the supermajority, that possibly with less than 40% of the vote, of the popular vote, they could get 150, 200 seat majority. I spoke to Ed Miliband about that, and at the moment their point there is this is just flailing about by the Conservatives. But when you speak to them privately, they are worried that apathy, some anger, as you've described it, Camilla, before, will mean the turnout will be depressed, and therefore Labour will not get the mandate that maybe they hoped.
Yeah, they keep on talking about the supermajority attack being voter suppression, but I'm not sure the logic quite works through. Surely the Tories want to G up and get people out and vote for them rather than other parties. So I don't think that line quite holds. So it'll be interesting to see how that one develops over the couple.
Let me just give you one Telegraph reader's reaction to the manifesto, which I just think is quite interesting in its interpretation. Noah Brock says, "I've just read the manifesto. It has to be one of the dullest ever. It is almost a repeat of the 1997 Labour manifesto, but without the excitement. I think we underestimate how radical the policies are regarding constitutional reform. The principal aim of the new Labour project is to undermine the sovereignty of Parliament by delegating power to quangos and other unelected bodies. It is essentially undemocratic and designed to make the changes they inflict on the country permanent." I mean, is that fair or scaremongering?
I'd have to go back, Camilla, to the 1997 manifesto to see if it is similar to what Tony Blair put out then. There is a very reasonable argument about arm's length organisations, which frankly was started much more powerfully under the Conservative government pre-Tony Blair's era. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did rely on them. I think there are some questions about how these arm's length organisations work. I think Rishi Sunak, did he not say that part of his savings plan is to take money out of these quangos? I don't think it's where the public's mind is. I think, that's a very good point from Noah Brock, one of our readers, and obviously he's done it he's looked at these things in some detail. But where the public is, and this is why, this person about cancer was doing, is the NHS and the economy. Can we make things better in those areas?
I think it might actually be one of those areas of tension. We've had the Tories in government for 14 years, so they've had the frustration of dealing with some of these kind of independent experts or third bodies, but it may well be Labour in power. In the Labour huddle earlier with the advisors, they were being challenged on this point. Well, look, when you take office, taxes are rising and spending has to be cut. So which of those are you not going to do? And their argument is essentially, oh no, don't worry, we'd boost lots of economic growth. And what happens if the OBR, when they score that straight in their first budget, says, well, no, these measures aren't actually going to trigger that much growth. You're going to have to cut deeper or raise taxes harder. That's where you can see some frustration with these bodies.
The one reason why Keir Starmer can't put a number on the immigration, on what level of immigration he wants, is because as soon as he puts a number on it, the Office for Budget Responsibility can score that against economic growth. Because if we reduce immigration at this stage in the cycle, economic growth, the OBR will say, will suffer, and therefore that is negative for the public finances. So neither the Conservatives nor Labour will put a number on it, because they know that will make it even tougher to sell this idea that without huge tax rises, we can still pay for public services.
Kamal, we've avoided it until now, but should we talk about Brexit briefly? Because it reappeared.
Let's
It
do that.
made a reappearance in the debate on Wednesday night. It was because I think Rishi Sunak was in Grimsby, which is a massive Leave area, and this is what he was asked.
Which is legal migration. For many years, people were frustrated that immigration kept going up. It was the number one reason for voters in the run-up to the EU referendum, one of the main reasons for Brexit. That's right, isn't it?
Immigration is too high.
No, one of the reasons people voted for Brexit was to take back control of our borders, right? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah? OK. Yes. OK. Well, let's just go.
Kamal, do Brexiteers have a right to be angry?
Brexit has not solved the problems that it said, or many people who campaigned for Brexit said it was going to solve, and those problems are still there: economic growth and immigration. Lots of people would have argued that it was never going to solve those problems. The fact was, you were always going to get a deal with the European Union, which was in economic terms not going to be better for the UK than where we were before we left the European Union. So economically, many people argued that that was always going to be the case. I think there are some upsides there we mustn't forget. If you think back to the COVID vaccines, the UK was able to have more autonomy around how it approached vaccines for our population, because we weren't involved in the EU-wide approach, which was slower, lumpier, set up some quite vicious arguments within the European Union. So that was one upside. You know, I used to be economics editor and business editor at the Telegraph. What we've been able to do in the financial area and the city, etc., has meant that there are some freedoms there that mean that foreign direct investment into the UK is strong. But the overall offer of Brexit was never going to work in the way the proponents of Brexit said it was going to work, because the EU simply wasn't going to agree to a situation where we could have the same economic relationship with our biggest trading partner. The thing is, though, and from here, Camilla, with the manifesto, it's not until you get to page 117 of the manifesto, which is only a few more pages longer than that, 125 pages long, that you get any mention of Europe. All the pictures of Keir Starmer are with global leaders. He's also got a picture with Zelensky of Ukraine. Nothing about Europe.
No.
And they say very clearly, Labour will stay outside of the EU. There will be no change in relationships with the single market, no free movement, no freedom of movement, no customs union. How much that has changed since Keir Starmer, as the shadow Brexit secretary, was demanding a second referendum. Again, another one of those issues where Labour has gone on such a journey that a lot of voters are going to be saying, well, what about in 2029? Will Keir Starmer have changed as much on Brexit again? So I think there is a weak flank there for Labour. But what the UK needs to do here, we can't relitigate Brexit. We need to work out how we create growth and how we control immigration. And sadly, Brexit has not been the answer to either of those two things.
Although the follow-back pro-European brigade on X and other social media are absolutely thinking that a Labour government is going to somehow reverse the referendum. The only leader we've heard speaking about this in any terms at all has been the Liberal Democrat leader, Ed Davey. By the way, Kamal, isn't it a bit odd on reflection? I've just thought about it as you were speaking. We've not really heard much on Brexit from Nigel Farage this campaign.
No, he's well aware. The polling, people have almost decided that Brexit hasn't given the country what many people hoped and thought it would. And they've moved on and said, OK, that's just another fail, another epic fail by the governing classes to not do what we asked them to do. Luckily, I think X/Twitter isn't the real world.
No.
I don't think there's any idea within the Labour leadership here. And Rachel Reeves, the first person to get a photograph in the manifesto that wasn't Keir Starmer, who is, as I said, photographed 33 times, is Rachel Reeves. The person sitting closest to him near the podium here at the Co-op headquarters in Manchester, Rachel Reeves. Rachel Reeves will do nothing, she believes, that could risk the Labour the Labour reputation for consistency. Rachel Reeves was consistent on Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes.
And I think that is what she is going to maintain throughout her time as Chancellor.
I love that idea that X isn't the real world. No, it's the underworld. That's probably the best
is.
way to discuss
As we face it.
as we know on a daily basis. Should we talk about Nigel Farage and this quest of his to unite the right? So look, we have discussed this on previous Daily Teas, haven't we? But he's kind of put his money where his mouth is, because he was quizzed on this by Nick Ferrari on LBC, and this is what he said.
I've intervened because we need a coherent voice of opposition in Parliament and in the country. And do you know what, Nick? I believe I can do that better than the current Conservative Party.
Can you tell me that one day you might lead the Conservative Party, or can you rule it out if the ball would come out of the back of the scrum?
I think something new is going to emerge on the centre-right. I don't know what it's called. But do I think I'm capable of leading a national opposition to a Labour Party with a big majority where I can stand up and hold them to account on issues? Yes.
Well, let's say it's called conform or
whatever.
reservative.
Yes.
So a merged party, you would be happy to lead a merged party?
Yes.
Would you be happy to lead the Conservative Party?
Well, not as it currently is. I mean, I wouldn't even...
so
No. Look,
if it were reworked, Mr. Farage...
They may be dead. They may well be dead. This may well be the end of their journey.
Kamal, conform, reservative. Can you see this happening? Because I can increasingly see it happening, you know. I mean, stranger things have happened.
Yes, those names are don't really trip off the the tongue, sadly. But Nick Ferrari did a good attempt there. I wrote on Monday, as I said, there's a huge reaction from our readers that unless Nigel Farage completely changed the way he approached politics, he would not be the right person at this stage to lead a reformed Conservative Party. I say that for two main reasons. To be successful in this first past the post system, and interestingly, in the manifesto, the Labour manifesto here, no mention of PR whatsoever. So Keir Starmer's just not playing in that space whatsoever. Yeah. Sorry, proportional representation. Keir Starmer's just not playing in that space. But to enable a new Conservative Party, whatever comes out of the wreckage that we imagine is going to happen on July the 4th, you have to be able to compromise. You have to be able to build a coalition. And frankly, there are many, many millions of people who cannot countenance voting for a party which has not only policies which some people would criticize, and in a way that's a debate. I can understand the debate on the policy prospectus from reform, on immigration, on reforming the NHS, on changing the NHS fundamentally. You know, I may or may not agree with all of those policies, and I can have that fight intellectually. The big issue that Nigel Farage has to think about is many millions of people won't vote for him because they believe in this tag that he's playing with dangerous cultural themes around who is welcome in this country and who isn't welcome in this country. We've seen the controversies that you've mentioned around people who have candidates who have discussed attitudes towards Islamism, towards the Muslim faith, which is a completely different thing, of course.
Well, he's addressed that today. Let's listen to it, Kamal, because he was asked this direct question again by Ferrari in the same interview, and this is what he said.
They're ordinary people. That's how people out there speak. That's how they feel.
Ordinary people,
they
Mr.
express
Farage, say
on
Islam
Facebook,
and Nazis are the same thing.
Facebook.
Islam and Nazis, they are the same thing.
People are allowed to have opinions. People are allowed to express views.
You're not supporting the idea that Islam and Nazis. Just to clarify there, Mr. Farage.
No, I'm scared of all fanaticisms.
You're equally scared of Islam as you would be...
No. You're making a very big mistake
I'm asking
here.
you.
I'm not talking about Islam.
Okay.
Well, that's the first time I've heard that, so I want to be careful about how I respond. There is definitely a tone to the way that some members of Reform have conversations about what type of country they live in. This idea that somehow their culture is being taken over, that people who come from different backgrounds can't be patriotic, that somehow people like me have to prove that I'm British. That tone is part of the reason why I don't believe, unless there is huge change in the way Nigel Farage speaks to the nation, that he can be a leader of a party that wants to be the government and therefore the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I'm very proud of the UK and the type of country it is, and the opportunities it gave my father, who came here from Sudan. He's dead now, sadly, but is a Muslim. The fact that I am, very sympathetic. I'm not a Muslim myself, but I'm very sympathetic with the Muslim faith, Islamic faith. And the tone just isn't there. And I think that politics is about the bridges that you can build. It is not about the dividing lines that you can fight on. And politics, just like for the hard left, for the right, is lost because you motivate your base. I understand that. And maybe people are speaking about in the way that some people describe in the pub. But frankly, conversations in the pub are not a manifesto for government.
No.
And those conversations can go on. But until what did Theresa May once describe the Conservative Party as, the nasty party? Well, there's got to be, if Nigel Farage is really true to the idea that he wants to lead the country possibly, well, he's going to need to think very deeply about what type of country does he want to live in, and therefore voters can decide about whether they want to vote for that for the UK.
It's really interesting because you're talking about this need to be more moderate and have a wider appeal, and yet he seems to be doubling down on some of this rhetoric. I mean, I've never heard him more sort of unvarnished than in that interview earlier. I mean, yes, the polling, I've got it in front of me here, Savanta polled people and they said that, yeah, he was the politician that people would most want to have a pint with. And at the end of the day, all adults polled, who would you rather have as Prime Minister? Keir Starmer 44%, Rishi Sunak 25%, Nigel Farage 17%. That's the big question as well, Kamal, moving forward. I think Reform are expecting this crossover moment next week where they overtake the Tories. But the question for pollsters is, where do they top out? Because they might end up on a figure that begins with a 2 rather than a 1, but it might end there. And also, if we look at the closest comparisons, say Canada, I mean, clearly there's this extent to which I think Farage is modelling himself on what happened in Canada, 1993. The Progressive Conservatives totally wiped out, retained 2 seats. Reform then take over as the movement on the right. It takes Stephen Harper, I think, a good 13 years to get the Conservatives back on track, and then he ends up winning on behalf of the right in Canada 3 subsequent elections. But he's a different politician to Nigel Farage, isn't he?
Exactly, and it is certainly seems like, and we spoke about this, and I think our colleague Philip Johnson wrote about this. That is the Farage playbook. He looks at Canada and sees that there was something that could be seen as somewhat similar to the journey of the right in the UK, but all the data and all the evidence is that you need to compromise, and that parties that are able to compromise. I was criticised, and I understand this actually, about centrism. Centrism's over, and I actually get it. And I think that's a reasonable point to make. It's not about being centrist, but it is about being in some way bridging and bringing different groups together, because that's how you run democracies. And at the moment, as you say, he's doubling down because he's motivating his base. Because what he needs now to vote for him is his base. He's not running to be the Prime Minister of the country. So he needs to motivate his base. And I think he has exactly the same problem which he needs to deal with that the left has had over many, many decades of when it swings left, fewer people say, oh, yes, you could be the government. Yes, they'll vote for you as a protest, but not to be the government. And I think Mr. Farage needs to think, if I really want to be a leader of the reformed right, who am I bringing in so that people who may vote Conservative but don't like the tenor of the discussion, particularly around Muslims. If you see some of the comments that people make about Islam and about Muslims in the United Kingdom, and you replace those words with Judaism and Jew, you would not be able to say the same things. You simply would not be able to say the same things. The kind of things that I've had sent to me since writing this piece about being an alien, not understanding the culture. This is not necessarily from reform people. I'm not suggesting for a moment this is from Nigel Farage, but that tone is too closely aligned with where reform is, and what is Nigel Farage going to do to solve that issue?
Although awfully there have been some grotesque things said about Jews in recent months. I get the Jacob Rees-Mogg argument, by the way, that, you know, we want a united coalition, because if you look at the numbers, and you were talking about the Labour Party on course to win a supermajority, potentially with a lower vote share. So if you just look at the latest polling that puts Labour on 39%, the Cons on 19%, and Reform on 17%, you know, you add up Conservatives and Reform, and you get an almost equal number to Labour. So you have got a load of righties facing the prospect of a Labour supermajority, votes in at 16, so a Labour government, I don't know, for time immemorial, and yet half the country still seems to swing right.
It's what kind of right do they want to offer the country? Is it an optimistic prospectus for the future, or is it a divisive prospectus on we're going to battle our enemies? And I think a lot of people on the right, what do they most dislike about the left when they're called scum? You know, some people on the left call Tories scum and vermin and rats and genuinely hate Tories. Well, that's not the kind of left that succeeds in elections. And I don't think the kind of right that succeeds in elections hates what they describe as social democrats or the mushy middle. If you hate the other side, in the end, British people tend not to vote for you.